Hi everybody, it's Dave the Pharmacist here again. We are now on part 3 of our series of medications that you get after a heart attack. The title of this part is blood pressure / heart medications. So if you just got out of the hospital after a heart attack, you're going to get this whole list of drugs that I'm sure you're pretty uncomfortable with. And 2 of those drugs, at least, will say, if you go to the pharmacy and you pick up the drugs and you look at the printout, it will say, this drug is for blood pressure, or sometimes this is a heart medication. So this can be a pretty confusing area, especially for those of you that don't have high blood pressure, or one of these drugs you get will say this drug will slow down your heart rate, and maybe you don't have a fast heart rate. So you'll get these drugs, many of you, I should say, will get these drugs anyways, even if you don't have high blood pressure. So I think there's some things that we should clarify just to let you know what's going on here, because I can understand that you don't really see the logic in this, especially if somebody hasn't had time to sit down and talk to you about it. So that's where we'll go today. To start, I think what we'll do is we'll just start at the simple basics of blood pressure, if that's okay, before we get into the detail of the drugs. But I think a little bit of basics will help us move forward as we talk about the drugs that you received. The first thing I want to talk about is blood pressure. If you, in case you haven't thought about blood pressure in a while, you don't really know what it is. The simplest way to think about blood pressure is just to take your pulse. So, you can go into your arm and you can put your fingers on your thumb side of your wrist, on the underside thumb side of your wrist, and find that little pulse. You can find a pulse, which is basically an artery or a blood vessel that is pushing against your finger with every heartbeat. You can also find a pulse in your neck. You can find an artery in your neck, and you can feel that same pulse. You can even put your hand on the top of your foot, and you can find kind of around the crease of your foot, and you can try to find a pulse in your feet. When you're at the doctor's office, sometimes the docs like to take pulses in your feet just to see that there's lots of blood getting down there and you've got good blood flow to your feet. So this idea of taking your pulse, the reason why you can take your pulse is because you have blood pressure that goes up and down with every heartbeat. So if you think about your heart, it's just a big pump that every second is pumping blood out into all of your blood vessels. Well, that's what you're feeling every time you feel a pulse in your arm or your neck, is you're feeling that wave of blood that has been pumped into the blood vessels, into the arteries in this case, and you can feel these arteries as that wave of blood comes into that section of the artery. These artery walls are kind of rubbery or stretchy, so they will, because of the extra blood being pumped into that section, they will expand, and they'll expand into your finger. And so that's why you can feel that pulse with every heartbeat. And essentially what you're feeling is the pressure inside of that blood vessel, the amount of blood increasing. The pressure increases and opens up that vessel or stretches it open with every heartbeat. So that is essentially blood pressure. If you've ever looked at a blood pressure result, though, you'll always notice that there are 2 numbers, not just one. And so what they'll do is they'll measure the pressure every time at the top of a heartbeat. So the top number, and I'll just pause. So the top number that you can see, if you've ever seen your blood pressure being recorded, there's 2 numbers. The top number represents the pressure when you feel your pulse, when every time you feel your pulse. In between beats, the pressure doesn't drop to 0, even though you can't feel it, but in between beats, the pressure drops to a lower number, which you can measure as well. So, of course, anytime that you go to the doc's office and they put that cuff around your arm and they squeeze it up, they're basically squeezing your blood vessels shut, and they're seeing how much pressure it takes to open them back up again, and that's how they measure the pressure inside those vessels. So again, the top number you see there is the highest pressure that your blood vessels are exposed to during a heartbeat, and the bottom number is the pressure that your vessels drop to in between beats when there's no blood. There's still blood, lots of blood in there, but when the blood isn't being pushed and the heart is filling up with blood. So that's what this 120, highest pressure in your vessels and lowest pressure in your vessels. So they'll measure what I call the lub-dub. When you listen to your heart, they'll measure the pressure at lub and the pressure at dub. The other number that sometimes you see in there is called your heart rate. So sometimes if you've seen after your doctor has given you a checkup, he or she will write down the blood pressure, whatever your blood pressure was, and they'll also write down another one, which is called your heart rate, or the number of times your heart beats in 1 minute. So these numbers, I've sort of shown you the average here of these numbers. For blood pressure, they say that the average normal, healthy young man or woman will have a blood pressure less than 120 on top, and their pressure on the bottom, or their lowest pressure, will be less than 80. So probably 115 over 75 is about perfect blood pressure if you're 21 years old. And although there is a lot of variation, a lot of people walking around with blood pressures that are much different than these, and we'll talk about that a little later. Same with heart rate. So this heart rate is a heart rate that 70 beats per minute, or your heart beats 70 times per minute. That's about the average. But again, there's lots of people with variations. In our cardiac rehab class, if we were face to face right now, I always have a competition to see who has the lowest blood pressure. And we always will make a point out of showing that even people with low blood pressure still get some of these blood pressure drugs after a heart attack. And that's something that causes a lot of people anxiety, and it seems ridiculous. I totally acknowledge that, but we'll talk about why that might be that you'd still get one of these later. So for now, let's just get back to this concept of blood pressure and why it's important. So there's a couple of reasons why blood pressure is important, and we'll talk about the simple stuff first. Simply put, blood pressure represents the amount of energy that your heart needs in able to pump blood into your blood vessels. So here's a picture of a heart. Now, you're going to laugh. This is more of a Valentine's heart than an actual real heart, but I always draw them like this because I'm a terrible artist. So here's a picture of your heart. When your heart is pumping blood out into the blood vessels, there's only one blood vessel that receives blood from the center of the heart, and that's called the aorta. And that doesn't matter. The name doesn't matter. But basically, when your heart is pumping, there's only one way in to fill the center chamber of your heart, and there's only one way out to fill for the heart to be pumping. And of course, when we're talking about these vessels, these are the big vessels that are delivering blood to all places in your body. What we're talking about here is probably best thought of if you think about the heart like a donut, where the muscle part, or the meat of your heart, is basically, of course, all the muscle is around the outside of the heart, whereas the inside of the heart is a hollow chamber that is that is receiving blood from one type of blood vessel that drains all of the blood in your body and brings it back to the heart and the lungs. And then it fills the center chamber, and then that heart is pumped out, causing blood pressure, like we just said. Now, just one clarification here before we go any further. I just want to make sure we're not getting confused, because we've already talked about a different kind of blood vessel already. If you remember, when we were talking in, I think, part 1 or part 2, we were talking about heart attacks, and we were talking about blood vessels that can be blocked and can rupture. So if you haven't watched that one yet, maybe you should go back and check it out. The part 1, we were talking about the blood vessels that can get blocked. Now, I just want us to be clear that these are not the same blood vessels in the same location as these ones that are pumping blood mechanically out to the body. This little blood vessel, if you remember, that was delivering blood to, we said, 3,000 heart muscle cells. This guy, these blood vessels that can get blocked, this blood vessel is a blood vessel that is kind of snaking in, around and in to feed the heart muscles. Say our 3,000 heart muscle cells were right there. This is the kind of vessel that can get blocked. These are the very much smaller vessels that are actually feeding the donut or the meat of the heart. Right now, we're talking about blood that is entering the middle of the heart and then just being pumped out mechanically. So this blood that is being pumped out, just to be clear, once it enters this aorta, or this first blood vessel or artery that exits the heart, it branches off into all sorts of blood vessels that will, feed your feet, your shoulders, and your hands. I told you I was a bad artist. There'll be one that goes up and feeds your brain, and of course, this vessel also branches out into a smaller vessel and comes back and actually feeds the muscle of your heart. And these are the ones that get blocked up. So I don't want us to get confused about the blood vessel we were showing before and the blood vessel right now that we're talking about for blood pressure. So I've just cleaned up this picture, and I want to come back to this idea of blood pressure. So right now we're talking about big vessels, this big vessel that accepts all the blood and is sort of the main highway that delivers blood to all sections of your heart. And the pressure or the force that's used to deliver all that blood is basically this heart that contracts and relaxes, squeezes blood out and pushes it into this system so it can be delivered to all other parts of your body. So we're talking about blood pressure right now. And so if you think about blood pressure as sort of the amount of blood, the amount of pressure inside this vessel right here, so let's say this pressure is 120/80, that represents a fairly light pressure that is easy to overcome for your heart muscle. So everybody talks about the heart as being, lots of people think about the heart as being a big, strong muscle, but really our hearts are wimpy. We have wimpy hearts. They're just kind of small. The muscle inside them is not sort of weightlifting, strongman muscle. It's more of endurance muscle or marathon runner muscle. If you've ever seen a marathon runner, you see somebody who can run and never stop and never seem to get tired. So they need muscle for that marathon race. But the muscle that they have is not big, it's not bulky, it just is a muscle that is very efficient and can go for long periods of time. And that's what we want out of our heart muscle. So whenever you think about your heart muscle, just think about a little wimpy marathon runner that is just pumping pressure that is very easy to overcome about every second, 70 times a minute. And we want this type of muscle to be very efficient and lean and overcome this very light pressure. It just so happens that 120/80 blood pressure is very light for your heart to overcome. So let's think for a second about what would happen if the pressure in here, instead of being 120/80, let's say, what if the pressure inside your blood vessels was 180/100? So in other words, we go from a pressure of 120 on the pump of every beat to 180, and in between beats, the pressure is 80/100. So we're at now 180/100, and that's the pressure inside our blood vessels now. So this type of high blood pressure can occur for many reasons. The most common thing, of course, of having high blood pressure is just because somebody is exercising. So if you're exercising or you're upset, your nervous system is going to make sure that you have lots of pressure so you can fill all your muscles with blood and run your race or do whatever that you want to do. But if you think about that pressure, that pressure is very easily dealt with by the heart for short periods of time. But there are some people in this world who have a condition called high blood pressure or hypertension, and essentially they have blood pressure at these types of levels even when they're sleeping. So if you think about somebody that gets a pressure of 120/100 when they're running or exercising, that's great because we want to challenge muscle cells every day, because those muscle cells will then prepare themselves for a challenge the next day, as long as this pressure goes back to normal when they relax or sleep in the night. And that's the key to the benefits of exercise, is challenging your muscles so they will respond. They will get stronger for tomorrow. They will become more efficient. And then, but the key where all those good changes occur is in the night when you're sleeping, when your blood pressure drops back down, when they have a chance to respond to that challenge they had in the day. Now, people with high blood pressure, their body is not able to lower their pressure back down to a resting level, a level where all of the body recovers and heals itself. And so essentially, people with high blood pressure, when they go to sleep at night, the pressure inside their vessels is still at the same level as it was when they were running around the track or doing their exercise or yelling at their kids or whatever. So as you can imagine, over time, there's wear and tear on having high blood pressure. And one of the things that gets worn out is simply your heart muscle, because your heart muscle, when you're exercising, of course, when you're relaxed and your pressure in your heart is only, in your blood vessels, is only 120/80 or whatever, your heart is able just to run its little marathon using a very easy pressure. But if that pressure goes up to 180/100 or higher, or whatever, if it's elevated, then your heart muscle, in order to be able to pump out the same amount of blood for every stroke, now when it's connected to a blood vessel system that has a higher pressure, say 180/100, now every beat has to look like this. Instead of course, the marathon runner who's just easily pumping that blood out. So every single heartbeat now needs a little extra energy. And if that energy is required 24 hours a day, then those muscle cells never get a chance to heal, regenerate, produce more protein in there, produce more gas stations that basically make the chemical reactions that produce energy to make that contract. So that's from blood pressure point of view, one of the negative consequences of having slightly higher blood pressure over long periods of time is just the consequence on the muscle itself of your heart, and it can get worn out and changes can occur, negative changes can occur if it never gets a rest. So that's one reason why docs are really concerned about blood pressure, especially after you get out of the hospital after a heart attack. We want to maximize your blood pressure. Make sure that it's not high. So we maximize, this is the word I'm looking for, maximize the ability of your heart muscle cells to regenerate, to heal in the night when you're sleeping. We still love exercise. We still love short-term increases in blood pressure because that actually triggers those cells to become healthier for the next day. I don't know if you have ever thought about this, but have you ever thought of somebody, have you ever been very fit in your life where you've exercised every day and you feel, over time that you can do more and more as you get fitter? But then if you stop exercising, it's funny, you lose your fitness. And the reason is because our muscle cells in our body, for some reasons we won't get into here, but our muscle cells in our body, they actually will just set themselves for just enough protection, just enough, equipment inside their cells that will get them through the next day. So if they're challenged every single day, they will increase the amount of equipment, they'll increase the amount of protective proteins and, like I said, gas stations in there if they're being challenged every day. If they're not being challenged every day, those muscle cells will get rid of those extra gas stations, they'll get rid of that protein, and because they always keep themselves at the set point of the least amount of equipment inside them as they can get away with. So that's why you can be fit for some period of time, but if you stop, it's gone. You got to work and get that all back again. So that's why we like people to be exercising every day, have a good lifestyle, and not just exercise, but just be active, and that will help your cells become resistant and more ability to take on difficulty if you ever had another heart attack or whatever. So now I'm starting to digress, and I'm sorry, but I tend to do that. We're back on blood pressure. The point is that blood pressure, we want it to be elevated every day for a short period of time, but we want, when you're relaxing, we want it to be dropping to a decent level. And sorry, that's my puppy. And we want it to drop to a new level, a low level, so your heart can recover. But there's more to the blood pressure story. So that's the simple one. You might say, actually, I'll save that for later. The next potentially damaging part of having higher blood pressure, really in anyone, but right now we're talking about after a heart attack, the potentially damaging part of having high blood pressure is also on the walls of your blood vessels. So I'll draw you another fancy picture. So here's a fancy picture of a blood vessel. If you remember back in part 1 or part 2, I think, when we were talking about blood vessels, I had sort of shown you the side angle of a blood vessel. But now let's just cut it down the pipe, and we'll look at the blood vessel straight on, as if we can go. The blood is coming straight at us here. So let's think about blood pressure from this perspective. Now, at the beginning of this session, I told you to take your pulse. And so basically, when you were taking your pulse, you just took your finger, this is my finger, and you pressed it against you found an artery, in your wrist or in your neck, and you just put your finger, you found it, and you could feel this thing pulsating up and down because the pressure inside was with every heartbeat was going up. Now, here is the blood vessel that is that you felt that blood pressure in. So I wonder, can you imagine now the pressure inside this blood vessel? There is a possibility this pressure can get too high. If pressure is too high for too long a period of time, it can actually start to cause wear and tear or damage on the wall of this blood vessel. And I'll just remind you, I think in our discussion again about the antiplatelet agents in part 2, we talked about a little group of cells that line the inside wall of this blood vessel, and they're called endothelial cells. So I've drawn these little endothelial cells. I didn't draw them the whole way around, but normally they're the whole way around. But if you remember, I told you that there's a line of cells called endothelial cells that basically stand shoulder to shoulder and protect the inside walls of your blood pressure, of your blood vessel. Now, of course, if blood pressure is very strong for a long period of time, and it's not it's not sort of giving you a lowering when you're resting or sleeping, then you get this constant pressure against these endothelial cells that over time can actually start to damage those endothelial cells. And some things that can happen, of course, is if you start to get some damaged or some pushed aside, sometimes you can get gaps between the endothelial cells that'll sort of expose the wall of the blood vessel. And that is actually might be one of the causes or one of the initial reasons why these blockages can start to occur by sort of these gaps in these endothelial cells if they start to get damaged. So, in a normal blood, in a blood vessel of somebody in cardiac rehab, we know that sometimes these vessels can get blockages in them. Typically, that means there's some endothelial cells that have been lost. And, for this reason, we're really keen on making sure blood pressure, isn't too great on the walls, on our endothelial cells, and, I guess even logically on our little blockages themselves. So this is the other reason why blood pressure and, blood pressure drugs are used in people just to make sure that they don't have high blood pressure after a heart attack, and to make sure that we keep their blood vessels healthy. And of course, as we said before, we keep that little donut of meat, these muscle cells, healthy inside their heart. So, those are two simple reasons, two simple ways of thinking about blood pressure that and the reason why we care about it, especially after a heart attack. So I hope you're sitting at home and you're thinking about challenging me on all of these things, and that's great. The one question that you should be thinking now, a lot of you should be thinking is say, geez, Dave, I don't have high blood pressure, and yet the docs are still giving me these blood pressure drugs. And in fact, you'll find one of the biggest arguments we have, biggest areas of concern we have in people that come to our cardiac rehab class, is that people will say, not only do I not have high blood pressure, but I have low blood pressure. My blood pressure is way below 120/80, and yet the doc is still telling me I need to take these blood pressure medications, and it makes no sense. So, the similar story is people with low heart rates. Say you may be sitting there saying, "Oh, my heart rate is 62 beats per minute," and yet I'm still getting this beta blocker, this drug that potentially lowers my heart rate. And I'll tell my doc, and my doc will say, I want to keep you on it. So I actually have an explanation for why, if you're having a fight with your doc right now about being on one of these medications, I have an explanation for why the docs will still want to write that prescription even if your blood pressure is low. And the basic reason here is that some of these blood pressure drugs, they do more than just lower blood pressure. And so I'll give you a couple of examples, and examples that probably be most meaningful for people after a heart attack. The first example is a class of drugs that many of you have probably received called beta blockers. Just if you want to check your medication list to see if you've got one of these beta blockers, I've written the names of a few of them here. To know if you've got a beta blocker, usually all you have to do is look at the end of the name and see if there's an LOL at the end. Metoprolol, atenolol, bisoprolol, carvedilol. Anything with a lol at the end probably means that you've got a beta blocker. And these beta blockers are very popular. They're a drug that are given to a very high number of people after a heart attack. And interestingly enough, they are given to people often even if they have low blood pressure and if they have a low heart rate. So let's just talk about for a second why that might be. Beta blockers are a class of drugs that interfere with a hormone I'm sure you've all heard about, a hormone called adrenaline. They don't call it adrenaline as much anymore. There's sort of two main types of this adrenaline type hormone called epinephrine or norepinephrine. But for simplicity's sake, because in my normal world, I still like to call it adrenaline because adrenaline means something to me. I think all of you have probably experienced the feeling that adrenaline gives you. I live in Canada in the north, and we have some pretty cold winters here, and our roads get pretty slippery. So, if you're driving down a winter road, and all of us have almost, put it into the ditch or lost control for a short second, or any time that you've been scared or felt danger, you can feel a surge of adrenaline. Your body, your brain recognizes danger, and it will send signals to your adrenal gland, and it will send signals to lots directly through your nerves to some of the organs in your body to increase the amount of adrenaline delivered into your blood or just directly to your organs like your heart. If adrenaline is released into your body, I'm sure you've all felt it before. All of a sudden you're more awake than you've ever been. You feel like you had 10 cups of coffee. Your heart is pounding through your chest. Sometimes you feel jittery. If you could measure your lungs have opened up and they can take in more air. And, that's the effect of adrenaline. We've all felt that, and we felt those big surges of adrenaline. The interesting part of adrenaline is adrenaline can be released not just if you think you're going to roll your car or get hit by a ball flying through the air, but adrenaline can also be released if you've undergone injury or damage. And one of the examples is people after heart attacks. So of all of you people who've had a heart attack out there, especially if you've had some damage to some of those muscle cells, if those cells have been damaged, chances are your body will be responding by increasing the amount of adrenaline floating around in your blood. So, adrenaline is a good hormone to kind of give you energy and push you through and help you through difficult times. But it's not exactly the best hormone to help you recover after a heart attack. So one of the things that is a target of people after a heart attack, especially if they've had damage to their heart muscle cells, is to actually try to shield your heart muscle cells from the effects of adrenaline, because we want your heart muscle cells to heal and recover, and adrenaline will just keep pushing them to work harder. So time for another picture. I'll show you another artistic work from Dave. So what I've drawn here is this long little string-like feature is, let's just say this is one heart muscle cell. So again, we said you probably have about 3 million of these in your heart, and they all shorten or contract together to cause the heartbeat, and then they relax, shorten, relax, shorten. So that's what this guy's doing, relax and shortening all day. And I've drawn this funny little picture outside of the heart muscle cell, and this is called a receptor. Maybe I should write that for you. So this is called a receptor, and in this specific case, let's say this is called a beta receptor. Now, receptors are something that are used by your body, by the cells in your body, and there's tons of different kinds of receptors. Basically, what they are is they are the mechanism by which messages in the blood, like hormones, can be delivered to cells. They're delivered through these little receptors, or basically what these are is, like a baseball glove or a catcher's mitt that will catch hormones that are floating around in the blood. So here's our little baseball. There's our baseball glove. This guy's going to go right into that baseball glove. These receptors are interesting because the receptors are almost always made only for one type of hormone or one type of molecule. So in this case, let's say that this is a molecule of adrenaline. So let's say adrenaline is floating in your blood, and there it is floating in your blood. And this guy here is a receptor that is made just for adrenaline. That type of receptor we call a beta receptor. So beta receptors are on heart muscle cells. They stick out into the bloodstream, and they'll just sit there sort of all the time until adrenaline is floating by. These things are kind of interesting because, they'll have there must be a way how this fits perfectly into that little receptacle. And probably the way that it works is, this adrenaline molecule has little charges, little magnets on it. Plus, that's a plus and a minus and a plus. I'll move my camera over just a little bit here. So I can't know if you can see that, but there's a plus and a minus and a plus. So this receptor is designed to have the magnets on the exact same spot. So probably as this guy's running by, these magnets sort of attach to that magnets, and that's how this guy's perfectly designed. In this case, the beta receptor is perfectly designed for adrenaline. And so if adrenaline is floating by, that adrenaline will kind of get sucked in here by a magnet, and it will park right into that receptor. Now, once it parks into this receptor, it turns this muscle cell on, and that muscle cell, now that adrenaline is here, this will signal the cell to all of a sudden start pumping faster and stronger. So this now, adrenaline has turned on this mechanism. Basically, the way it works is it fills this center chamber with more calcium, and calcium just makes the muscle, the protein fibers in there, makes them contract harder. So it doesn't matter how it happens, but that's basically what adrenaline does. That's how adrenaline causes your heart to be pumping faster and harder. Now, that's great. if you are out exercising, or you're in a race and you're trying to run as fast as you can, you're a little nervous, or whatever. Maybe you're running away from a burglar or a criminal, and you need to run faster, so adrenaline will help you run faster. So that's good. That's good under normal, healthy conditions. But what if this heart muscle cell has just been damaged after a heart attack? Well, if that's the case, this is going to make a damaged muscle that really needs to heal. It needs to heal and regenerate some of this damage inside of it from being suffocated. This adrenaline is not going to help this guy heal itself. So that's where beta blockers come in. So a beta blocker drug is basically a drug that is, it looks like that adrenaline molecule, but with some interesting differences. So that beta blocker molecule is a molecule that is designed to still go and fit inside this beta receptor, the receptor that is normally reserved for adrenaline. The beta blocker will also fit into that molecule, into that receptor. And so what that means is if you take a beta blockers will take up some of these spots, some of these receptors, so that the real adrenaline that may be floating in your blood actually has to go find somewhere else to park. So this guy, these adrenaline molecules cannot attach to this receptor, and so essentially what you've done is this beta blocker turns out to be just a shield to protect this heart muscle cell against the stimulation or the activation of adrenaline, so that this allows this guy more time to heal. So adrenaline's real claim to fame is in people who have had a heart attack and have had damage, quite a bit of damage to their heart muscle cells. Those people probably have higher levels of adrenaline because of that damage that your body can sense. And so a beta blocker will always be given to people in those situations to help protect your heart muscle cells from the potential damage, the stimulation of adrenaline to heart muscle cells that basically need to heal. And so that's why if your doctor is pushing a beta blocker on you and you're sitting there going, well, my heart rate is low and my blood pressure is low, but the doc is saying, I'd still like to keep you on this beta blocker. That's why. A constant fight, I think, and the logic inside of this is rarely gets communicated to people. And so it just feels like the docs are trying to just load up drugs on people. But really, it's not the case in most cases. Now, there's lots of people that take too many drugs, and I totally agree with that. So, but in this case, there is a reason. You decide whether that reason is worthy or not. But there is really good results of studies of beta blockers in people with heart damage. The flip side of this is the situation where somebody might have had a heart attack, but they went in and got their vessels opened up really quickly, and they didn't have much damage. So in this case, the role of beta blockers is probably less certain in people that basically have had no damage compared to people that have had damage. So you've had lots of damage. The one way, I guess everybody who's had a heart attack probably has some damage because that's why they call it a heart attack. But the one way, if you are at your doctor's office or you get a note from your doctor, I guess the one way to tell is through a test that called an echo or an echocardiogram. You might have got the results of your echo, and they'll give you something called an ejection fraction. An ejection fraction. That ejection fraction is usually expressed as a percent. So, you may or may not get this from your doctor, but probably if you've had a heart attack, you probably have gone through an echo or an echocardiogram, or you're going to go through one. And basically, that you can get, one of the things that they'll get out of there is called an ejection fraction. Now, there's a ton of information that you can get out of these echoes. And one of the simplest ones, and I'm not smart enough to know half the stuff that those guys are looking at in those tests, but one of the really useful things that come out of them is this ejection fraction. And essentially, it just gives you the percent of blood. It kind of represents the percentage of all the blood that is returned to the inside chamber of your heart. When your heart beats, it gives you the percentage of that blood that is actually ejected with every heartbeat. So 40, 50, 60, you'll get a percentage like that. If your ejection fraction is low, so if it's 40% or less, 30%, 20%, then this is the kind of ejection fraction that says that probably you've had some damage to your heart muscle cells. And so that means probably you'll have some ongoing adrenaline levels in your blood that might be higher than normal. So we know that people with this ejection fraction, with people with a lower number for their ejection fraction, like 40 or less than 40, we know that beta blockers are really, really protective in these people, because essentially they'll shield those heart muscle cells from people who have ongoing challenges, just ongoing damage to their heart that hasn't healed up in the months after the heart attack. 60% and above, interestingly, your heart doesn't pump out that much extra blood. That much blood doesn't pump out 100% of the blood that's returned to it. So, a number of 60% or higher is pretty good. 40 to 50% is probably, in between. So this is probably represents some damage, 40% and lower. 50% is probably mediocre, pretty good, not great, not terrible. And over 60% is usually probably means that, the amount of ongoing damage hasn't been really all that great. So why I tell you that is because you may want to look, and I know everybody, the common question that I get in cardiac rehab classes, how many of these drugs can I stop taking, over the next few years versus do I have to take these all for the rest of my life? This may be one area where, again, just take this slow, but this may be one area where you can talk to your physician. If you've had a heart attack, really a lot of people will end up with one of these beta blocker drugs. Again, it doesn't matter if your heart blood pressure is high or if your blood pressure is low. After a heart attack, most people will probably get a beta blocker. The decision now in this day and age about whether to continue that beta blocker for life has really sort of changed over the years, because we're getting more and more people that come out after a heart attack with really hardly any damage. So I'll tell you this. I think, the American Heart Association traditionally has said, if you've had a heart attack, if you've had a big heart attack and you've got an ejection fraction that is low, keep that beta blocker on. Let's keep shielding those heart muscle cells for forever, just to make sure that they're able to heal and not get overworked when you're sleeping or whatever. The scenario is people who've walked out of a heart attack with virtually no damage, very, very little damage, and their heart is functioning very well. There may be an opportunity in those kind of people to discuss with your doc about that beta blocker medication could be stopped potentially in those kind of people at some point in the future. I think the American Heart Association says give it 3 years, maybe give it 3 years, And, if there's no heart damage and things are going well, I think it's a conversation you can have with your doc. It's potentially one drug you could dump off of your big list of drug medications. Again, if you remember back to the antiplatelet discussion we had, you also got to you'll get to stop one of those antiplatelet medications too. So there might be opportunity to, again, especially for those people without much damage, to stop a beta blocker down the way. Again, I would say though, probably again, you got to talk to your doc. You got to get their take, or whoever looks after you, whoever your care provider is. And but I would say, if you've got ongoing damage, your doc will argue for keeping at least some beta blocker on as a shield, even if your heart rate or your blood pressure, even if it's kind of low, your docs will probably want that shield if you've got some damage. So, we've talked a lot about this. We started out talking about blood pressure. Now we're talking about beta blockers. I used the example of beta blockers because beta blockers is one of the drugs recommended in heart attacks for this reason, after heart attacks. And you'll have to navigate out this individual issue with your doc and your care providers, whoever else, if you've got a nurse or a pharmacist who's helping out. Have a good talk with them and figure out what's best for you here. So I don't want to keep going too long about this blood pressure issue because we got to get to other drugs. But there's probably many people will end up with two blood pressure / heart medications after a heart attack. One of them will be the beta blocker, the LOL drug. Just look for a LOL, atenolol, metoprolol, carvedilol. And the other drug likely that you would have got is an ACE inhibitor, or what you can also call as a PRIL drug. ACE inhibitors is another class of drugs that is recommended, and I call these, I don't know if you can see this very well, I call them PRIL drugs, P-R-I-L, PRIL drugs. And the reason why is because in this ACE inhibitor family, all of the drugs, and there's a ton of them, I've only just given you a few examples here, ramipril, lisinopril, perindopril, enalapril, trandopril. Again, remember all drugs usually have two names. So one is a name the company gave them, and the other name is sort of the actual drug name. So if you don't see one of these drugs written right away, just look for another name on there and maybe you'll find it. So again, ACE inhibitors, the reason why we're talking about these, ACE inhibitors are a class of drugs that are often prescribed after a heart attack with beta blockers, the LOL drugs, and they're often given to people even if they don't have high blood pressure. So again, we're just talking about the scenario that where you're getting these drugs even if you don't have high blood pressure. Now, I'm sort of conflicted at this point in the video because the video is getting kind of long and I'm probably boring you to death. You've probably, half of you turned it off by now. So I don't know if I should get too much into the ACE inhibitor mechanism of action. I'll just give you a simpler explanation compared to the beta blockers because you already sort of get the idea. Here is another drug that is inhibiting a hormone that can be elevated after a heart attack or can be elevated in people with conditions, with health conditions or heart conditions. This drug will help lower other hormones that can potentially be harmful in people who are trying to recover their heart muscle after a heart attack. So these ACE inhibitor drugs are used in this time. It's not for adrenaline. There are different hormones. The hormones that the ACE inhibitors will block are two hormones called angiotensin II and aldosterone. So angiotensin II and aldosterone are two hormones that can also be increased after a heart attack. And just similar to the story about the the adrenaline issue, where you got these hormones that are sort of pushing to a heart muscle that's trying to relax. These hormones are similarly, if they're increased, they can cause difficulty for your heart muscle trying to heal itself. They can also increase blood pressure, make your blood pressure higher. For example, this aldosterone hormone. This is a hormone that one of its main jobs is to force your kidney to reabsorb as much salt as possible, and prevent salt from being peed out into your urine. So essentially what it does is it prevents you from getting rid of salt in your urine, because aldosterone, of course, in the old days, I don't know how much you're interested in, prehistoric man or the way men and women lived in ancient times, in prehistory, before civilization and stores and all that sort of stuff. Salt, or sodium, is a molecule that actually really doesn't exist in very high amounts in a diet of somebody who's living just generally off the land. So if you think of back in the old days, if you had like cavemen or people living off the land in the old hunter-gatherer societies before cities and before all that sort of stuff, these hunter-gatherer type people, they would just eat what they could, and if they, and maybe early in human history, before they had, good spears and good stuff to kill large animals, they were probably living largely on a vegetarian diet, and then they were getting a large animal or getting some animal protein. Rarely in those kind of diets, a largely vegetarian diet is very low in sodium, because there's not very much salt inside of plants. And so at those times, aldosterone was a hormone that helped the body prevent the body from excreting your salt in your urine. So the kidney, one of the main jobs of the kidney loves salt. And this is one of our problems in this day and age, because now everything we eat has salt in it. But we still have a kidney that was programmed, 150,000 years ago, at a time when salt was scarce. And so the kidney is still, tries to prevent the body from peeing out salt. So it's sort of one of the jobs of the kidney is to take, as the kidney is making urine, it tries to reclaim or reabsorb as much salt as possible, put it back into the blood so that it doesn't lose it in the urine. That was probably really useful 150,000 years ago. Now, not so much. And so, again, after a heart attack, a hormone like aldosterone can be elevated. And again, it's just another example of a hormone or an activity. We do not want your kidney reabsorbing salt. We want to, you probably get enough salt in your diet, so we don't mind getting rid of some salt actually in your urine. It's probably a good thing. So again, that's just an example of an ACE inhibitor, and why you'd be on an ACE inhibitor. Again, even if you don't have high blood pressure, there's a lot of other reasons other reasons besides just salt that these hormones actually have effects actually on the heart muscle itself, and probably problematic actions. So that's what the ACE inhibitor is doing, and that's why a lot of you will end up on a beta blocker and an ACE inhibitor, or a LOL drug and a PRIL drug. One last thing to say about this before we move on is if you don't have a PRIL, an ACE inhibitor, a ramipril or a perindopril, if you don't have one of those drugs, check on your list to see if you have a drug that ends in sartan. Sartan. I'll just write it. There is a cousin of the ACE inhibitor drug called an ARB, or an angiotensin receptor blocker. I call these sartan drugs because they always end in sartan. So I've just given you a list of some of them here. There's lots of these ARBs drugs: valsartan, irbesartan, losartan, osartan. So if you don't have an ACE inhibitor, a drug that ends in pril, just check to see if you have a sartan. These drugs are cousins of the ACE inhibitors. Some people who can't take an ACE inhibitor will sometimes be given an ARB. And so these drugs do almost the exact same thing as the ACE inhibitors. So most people then after a heart attack will be on a beta blocker and an ACE inhibitor, or a beta blocker and an ARB. Again, this ARB does the same thing as the ACE inhibitor in that they block the actions of angiotensin II and prevent aldosterone from being released into your blood. And so again, these are the drugs that many of you will have gotten even if you don't have high blood pressure. So I think I've kept you long enough about the blood pressure / heart medications. I've told you about the most common drugs that are given to people after a heart attack: beta blocker ACE inhibitor or beta blocker ARB. There are other kinds of drugs that you might get if your blood pressure is still high. You might get a diuretic, you might get a calcium channel blocker, you might get all sorts of other types of drugs. Again, I don't want to keep you too long. The main drugs that I've told you about are the main drugs that are recommended by most countries after a heart attack. And if you're feeling kind of discouraged because you feel like your doctor's not listening to you, if you kind of want to get off these drugs, keep having that conversation with your docs, but at least what the rationale is behind them. So I think that's all I have to